Before the focus on grand quest-like objectives that Black Ops 3 and future maps would attempt to focus on, the main goal for early maps was trying to see how long you can last, seeing how far you could go into the high rounds. And because most maps had their own strategies, weapons, or items that could help you in your survival, high rounds were achievable, even if the odds were stacked against you. In Noct, for example, you had the flamethrower, which you could always use in this help room or in the spawn room if you were good enough. But if that wasn't enough, you always had the option for the more iconic strategy, the camping spot at the ledge in front of the grenade wall buy. I guess I could say that if you knew what you were doing, Noct isn't that difficult compared to some of the other maps, but it can be tense because of how vulnerable you are as a player. Verruckts also has strategies you can do. Camping can be attempted, especially with how some of the zombie spawns are tied to what door you open. For example, the zombie spawn in the Speed Cola room is tied directly to which way you're entering. If you're going from the kitchen, the zombies won't spawn from the room's barricade until you open the next door. It is a semblance of control you have in a map where you practically have none. Though, because of how fast the zombies are and how unreliable your weapons become, that slight control you have is taken away from you. Because if you stay there any longer, you'll probably die. Training ends up becoming your best way of reaching higher rounds alongside traps. Despite that though, I do really want to mention, I like the idea that you have to strategically decide which door you want to buy. It does give the player more control over the map and gives you a lot more options for how you want to progress through the rounds. But despite the fact that I mentioned Verruckts, there aren't a lot of options you can do on the map aside from progressing forward or not. And it is just an oversight and probably a glitch. But future maps would also have a form of manipulating zombie spawns. While not handled the exact same way, take a map like Kino der Toten for example, where if you decide to train on the theater stage, practically everyone recommends you to never buy this door since zombies can spawn and sneak up behind you, making this strat unfeasible. But moving on though, Verruckts added upgrades for the player, which was a very much needed innovation to grow the series from the bare bones nature of Noct. But because of how difficult the map can be, and the fact that you needed traps to progress, which was a band-aid type of a solution to the issue of reaching higher rounds, it was an apparent problem that Treyarch failed to tackle. It's because that, with the third edition, they aimed to fix the ability of achieving higher rounds and add on more to the innovations Verruckts would introduce. There was also another problem. It was clear by this point that Zombies was going to continue, and now an actual story had to be made. While you played through the story of the Marines in Noct and Verruckts, and there was a semblance of a theme within those maps, which we'll get into later, there wasn't an overarching plot that connected the story. And while they placed more of an emphasis on the story in Darice and in much later maps, there needed to be a good first step for creating this story. Shi No Numa, the third map in the World at War lineup, was the story's true beginning, and it kickstarted the plot that connected the maps in Black Ops 1 together, which would be known as Richthofen's grand scheme. But before I continue, as I'm traveling around this beautiful jungle of Birmingham, Britain, fulfilling my god-given right of taking out the average British person, you'll probably notice that, hey, the gameplay in this video looks different. It's because for this video, I'm using a mod that was released a while ago. This mod is called Shi No Numa Remastered, and it was created by a user known as JB Shady. Now, there are a lot of glitches and flaws in World War, like the black hole zombies and the fact that knifing is basically pointless. Shi No Numa has flaws, most of which I intend on tackling in this video, but what JB Shady has done is create potentially one of the best versions of Shi No Numa that you can play if you already bought World at War. It adds Black Ops 1 knifing, removes the black hole zombies, it adds a Black Ops 1 style Easter egg that you can do, it adds all the cool weapons from World at War alongside cut quotes. You also spawn in with the respective sidearm from the nation the characters are from. So if you're Dempsey, you spawn in with the M1911, but if you're Takeo, you get the Nambu pistol. And I haven't even gone into everything else. Not to mention JB Shady made mods not just for Shi No Numa, but for Darice and even Noct more recently. I'll leave a link to download the mod in the description alongside the YouTube channel and the trailer for you to check out. But going back, Shi No Numa is a mixed map when it comes to its reception. A lot of people don't think too highly of Shi No Numa, and in the cases they do, they usually place it right near Noct, or in rare circumstances, one of the worst maps in the whole series. I think it's a shame that Shi No Numa ended up getting that reception, especially when some of my favorite parts of the map got glossed over by far more popular videos like the Smith Plays retrospective or Tim Hansen's video on Shi No Numa. It's disappointing because I do think that while this map does have flaws, there are certain features on the map that make it stand out among the other lineups. And although it's not my favorite, as you'll find out later in this video, I've had a negative experience that hampered any appeal I've had for this map before I played the Vanguard version of Shi No Numa, and before I revisit the original map. I want to try to do this map fairly, and in the aim of the analysis series, try to be as fair as possible looking into this map and future maps. So, without further ado, let's begin.
06.96 101.
I hope you're receiving this transmission
must know by now that we failed to contain the asylum. Now we have to move the experiment here. Sis, I hope you get this. I hope it hasn't happened there too. But I'm almost out of hope.
Beginning the map, instead of being in an enclosed space or having a singular direction, Shi No Numa gives you this wide open space for you to traverse in. Now, Shi No Numa would go back to the original design of Noct by giving you two choices, through a gate door thing or going down the staircases, almost like the inverse of what they originally made in Noct. Ultimately, aside from the two starting weapons you can buy off the wall, this is the first choice the player has and reflects the general trend of map progression, but I'll go into that much more later. Either way, no matter which direction you go, you'll reach the first floor of the main hut and have your introduction to the outside parts of Shi No Numa. No longer are you trapped with concrete walls all around you with machinery, tools, and technology of the time. Instead, you're surrounded by a thick jungle and a swamp with huts made out of hastily added materials like wood, sheets of metal, and tires for some reason. Being set in Japan, the area does feel foreign, and you feel out of place. With the other two maps set in Germany, this one is in a whole new continent on the complete other side of the world. Much of the horror and atmosphere in Shi No Numa is established in the background rather than the inside of the map, but occasionally you'll hear ghostly whispers or things that you won't commonly hear during gameplay. This combined with hellhounds, maggots, flies, the meteor, and the general ambience of the map, there's this constant feeling that there's something more outside of the map. You don't know what, you don't know who, but there's something out there. Instead of giving you a power switch that you have to progress towards, they give you the mystery box and immediately show the map layout and show the choices the player has for where they'd like to progress. This is completely different from the previous maps. By giving you multiple ways of where you want to go, it empowers the player to have some semblance of control over the map. You choose where you'd like to go, and the map doesn't hold your hand and tell you where exactly you need to get to. Choice is a core staple of the Zombies formula, and it's one of the most important aspects of gameplay. It goes from something small like choosing which gun you want to use or replace, to something larger like how the map flows and how the map progression works. Without that semblance of a choice, Zombies would just get stale and repetitive. If every game was just this exact same playthrough and the exact same attempt, with the most minor of differences, the gameplay would just get incredibly boring. And that's one reason out of many as to why Origins isn't the best map of all time. Why? You thought I was talking about Mob? No, of course not. Mob's a great map. The footage is just unrelated. But moving onwards, like I said, choice is very important, which is why almost every single map onwards had some level of choice in the map layout after Shi No Numa, with some minor exceptions. The 4 pathways that you can head towards lead to huts that have the perks and the box locations. You make the active choice to decide which hut you want to go towards, but here I have to levy some heavy criticism. In Shi No Numa, the perks are randomized, meaning that the perks will always be in a different location each playthrough. But because of the way Shi No Numa handles randomized perks, while you're making the choice of heading towards a certain direction to gain perks, one fault of the system is the perks themselves. On the World of War version, Juggernog and Speed Cola are the 2 best perks in the game, with Double Tap being meh and Quick Revive being pointless. The huts are cool to look at, but you don't really have much of a reason to go back to them, especially when they're all essentially the same thing. And you especially have no reason to even set foot into a hut if you get a perk like Quick Revive on the World of War version. In a way, randomized perks, in the way they're currently implemented, actually works against the map, because it ends up becoming a cheap way for the map to say that you went the wrong way, which goes against the very point of the layout itself. You're supposed to be making a choice, and the map is essentially telling you that you were supposed to go a different way. The huts that you head towards aren't the best location. It's impossible to train or camp here, and the whole point of the huts is for the box locations and the perks. They're mostly the same gameplay wise, and end up becoming nothing but wasted space, and a random perk becomes the difference between an important area and an area you'll never go to. And not to mention, it does lose a sense of personality for the perks themselves. Mention how much more interesting it would be if Juggernog or Quick Revive was always placed in the doctor's quarters. On its own, it's not much, but it does make more sense, and it's far more interesting than placing Double Tap here. Like what, are the doctors going to be shooting their patients to death? Now, believe it or not, I don't mind randomized perks on its own. I honestly think it more so depends on the way they're implemented rather than the idea itself. If it's a guessing game as to where all all the perks are, which are essential to your in-game progression and the map flow, and ends up harming the map. If it's handled like Shadows of Evil, where they tell you which perk is where while still having randomized perks, I prefer it so much more. And with the way Shi No Numa has it implemented, it plays against that empowerment of choice that the map tries to add. Going back to what I said earlier, the choice you make for progressing through the maps is reminiscent of the very choice you make of where to progress in the spawn room. I didn't mention this, but the way you go absolutely does not matter. You always go to the same destination, and you never go back to spawn unless the box moves there. You have no reason to go back there at all, just like you have no reason to go back to a hut if you get the wrong perk. The only difference is that you have the ability to alter how fast the zombies spawn, which in and of itself is reflective of one of the more popular strats on this map, which is not to open the communication hut's door to prevent zombies from coming through it. Don't get me wrong, I love that semblance of control, but I think the spawn room ultimately summarizes my point about the layout much better than I can place it into words. It's open, and it serves its purpose at a minimum, but once you leave, you have no reason to come back. Now, assuming you opened up most of the map, or even before you decide to go for perks, one of the main focuses the player has is weaponry. Shi No Numa adds technically three new weapons into the map. I say technically because the Arasaka, which is just a reskin Car 98K. The map adds the Type 100, which by itself is a pretty good gun, but it's outshined by most of the other weaponry on the map. It's not a bad gun by any chance, and it really fits Shi No Numa, and I think it's also the last gun to be added into a map before Black Ops 2 on Die Rise, if we're not counting Wonder Weapons or the new guns on the launch map. And compared to the absolute titan of a gun that was added as well, the Type 100 is outshined by the real star of Shi No Numa, the Wunderwaffe. Treyarch decided to add a weapon that's essentially just a trap, but a gun, and it's honestly so much more useful. And this is a complete side note, but while Wonder Weapons are supposed to look out of this world or insane, I've always liked the way the Wunderwaffe looked, because it really fits World of War in my opinion. But the Wunderwaffe was the first new Wonder Weapon to be added to zombies aside from the ray gun, and being around when the ray gun was added, it made sense that some of the early ideas that they had for the ray gun would be added to the Wunderwaffe, albeit far more safe. If you shoot too close to yourself, you zap yourself, which can damage you and potentially kill you. But obviously, if you play smart and don't recklessly shoot everywhere or onto the floor, you'll probably be fine. The bigger threat from this isn't necessarily from the gun, but the fact that it does slow you down for a bit. At least, I think it does. It's so inconsistent that I can rarely tell in gameplay. Now, the gun deals an infinite amount of damage, meaning no matter what the zombie health is at any round, it'll kill them in one singular shot, which makes it a must-have for trying to reach higher rounds. Now, most of the decisions that Treyarch implemented would be used to empower the player. And in comparison to Nacht and Verruckts, which are generally tense for most players, the player is probably the least vulnerable on Shi No Numa in comparison to the rest of World of War. The only real threat the player has is losing too much ammo, or hellhounds. Additionally, on past Treyarch maps, they both had a 24 zombie cap limit on solo. For those unaware of what that is, on solo, there's a maximum of 24 zombies that can be spawned onto a map per round. Shi No Numa has this, meaning that if you want to progress, you just need to kill 24 zombies and the round will just move to the next. You can imagine how incredibly easy the map becomes at this point, because with just 2 shots from the Wunderwaffe, you can go from 24 zombies to just 4, and assuming you use all 3 rounds per round, which isn't even the best way to use the gun, you can essentially just constantly keep going into another round with just 3 shots. And with hellhounds constantly refilling your ammo and traps always nearby, there's really no limit as to how high of a round you can go. It's partially the reason why the current high round record is 11,000. But clearly, I'm not giving enough credit to Treyarch. Because see, in a way, the devs actually managed to add a whole new threat to the game. In previous maps, the zombies were an active threat, and always capable of ending your run quickly if you made one small wrong move. But here they added a new one. In Shi No Numa, the new threat is if your power goes out, you have to go outside for once. To be fair, because of how new the game mode was and how most players were just trash at the game, the 24 zombie cap limit wasn't an issue while those maps were being worked on and released. It makes sense that the developers never removed the zombie cap on Shi No Numa because it never was an apparent issue in the first place. Shi No Numa is an incredibly easy map, and it's commonly stated as a flaw of the map. And while I do partially agree, I do think there is one aspect that most people ignore. While yes, a lot of the map is dated and it's incredibly easy, I think for the time, it was a really good start to transition towards making high rounds viable. And I think that effect Shi No Numa had would reappear much later on. In Black Ops 1, the 4th map is Ascension, one of the most easiest maps of all time. It has a ton of wide open space, and really good weapons to get you to a much higher round. It's a beginner friendly map, and it's the same with Shi No Numa with a 24 zombie limit. That said, while being a beginner friendly map, it isn't the best for keeping people engaged when you become more experienced with the map. As I mentioned in my last video, most people play games to win. On our first instance of winning something significant, like getting a really high round, we might think of it as something really special and be proud of it. But if you're constantly achieving that round or even go higher, it ends up feeling like a hollow victory. That's partially why for some of the more experienced players, playing Shi No Numa isn't that fun, because you're always able to reach higher rounds, and that feeling you get of achieving that really high round feels like nothing. It's part of the reason that when it comes to my personal experience, I really didn't like this map. And in fact, I'm gonna go on record to say that when I was much younger, I really hated Shi No Numa. I thought it was a boring mess. I hated how slow the water made you on the map. I hated the pacing, the map layout, which I still don't like, and most of this map felt like a complete slogfest to play. It didn't feel as good as Doris or Kino when it came to me playing it, and for a long time, that was my impression of the map. It took me returning to Call of Duty Zombies after being mostly absent for years, working on the analysis series, and playing Vanguard for me to realize that the map didn't actually need to age well for long-time players. It didn't need to be the perfect map that would fix all the problems of the previous maps, and it didn't need to be the grand finale of World at War. For the most part, some of the World at War maps were experiments to see which direction worked well for the game mode. What the map needed to do was focus on empowering the player and allow for high rounds to actually be viable. And while I'm sure it went differently from what the devs intended, it did work. Instead of increasing the threat of the enemies or making the map incredibly difficult to the point that your smallest move mattered, the map was open and allowed for the player's choice to become center stage. The map focused on beauty through empowerment, which was absolutely necessary for the state of modern zombies. And while I'm sure you can give hundreds of critiques of the map and can maybe even claim how terrible this map is, I think a lot of the map flaws were absolutely necessary for the progression of zombies and especially for the players themselves. Now, there is one map I want to bring up real quick. In Black Ops 3, there's a map called Shadows of Evil, and when you look at its map layout, you'll notice that it has some influence from Shi No Numa. For example, literally right after the first door you buy, you immediately have multiple pathways that make up the entire map. The center of the map is right after the first door you buy, and it connects all the pathways of the maps and rituals. There is also the transportation system, but I'm not talking about that. In Shi No Numa, right after the first door you buy, you go into the center of the map that has multiple pathways that make up the entire map. The center of the map connects all the pathways, and there's no other way to get to the other parts of the map without going through the center. So, while other people and I might not like Shi No Numa's map layout as is, what is undoubtable is that Shi No Numa played an influence up to Black Ops 3 in its map layout, and that is a testament to how much Shi No Numa succeeded in giving the developers experience for future maps. And I do think people need to appreciate the map more for that reason. When it comes to the story of the map, Shi No Numa marked the beginning of a new story for zombies. See, in the previous two maps, there wasn't a plot that connected the two, but they had a theme that made the maps slightly similar. In Noct, with how it references salvation, ascension, and darkness, it has a sense of a religious undertone. Combined with the general ambience and the way the map is structured, it just has that religious undertone that makes the map a little bit more haunting. It gives a feeling of God has abandoned us, and it makes the map feel more creepy. And when you consider that you just survived a plane crash, which isn't really all that common, it gives a feeling that this area is your purgatory, and you're just trying to survive your inevitable fate. Verruckt does this as well, but it's far more different. In the kitchen room, if you look at some of the bloody words written on the wall, you'll notice that it mentions a biblical script. The zombies are perceived as this army of darkness and death, and it's a tone that was abandoned in Shi No Numa, unfortunately. With the meteors and mentions of Tunguska, the theme changed from the religious undertones to conspiracy theories and a whole lot of wacky stuff. To be fair, I do like what they did in Doris, and I do think the change was absolutely necessary, but as the years go by, god do I miss what they did in Verruckt and Noct. In any case, the map introduces the 4 original crew, or Ultimus. The characters would become the most iconic part of zombies, and would reappear in future maps. They're far more funny than serious like the Marines were. Now, one common critique people give to the characters on the map is that their quotes reduce the horror of the map. The logic being that because they say goofy quotes, it's hard to get scared of the map, or really take it seriously. While I do see the reason, I disagree with it. I think the reason why Shi No Numa is scary for some people, while also not being so scary for others, isn't because of the characters you play as, but because of the fact that the horror part of the map is through isolation, and most of the scary aspects of the map are outside of the map rather than inside. And it's also kind of hard to feel scared of that type of feeling when you're constantly hearing gunfire or zombies yelling. It's not because of the character dialogue. I do want to bring up this point. I'd say if you want to criticize the horror part of the map, you should instead criticize the approach of background horror, because there's actually a point to be made there, but Criticizing the quotes, it's entirely subjective. I mean, look, completely different game, but it's worth mentioning. The first Resident Evil has some of the worst dialogue in gaming, so much so it even has an award for it. And even then, the first Resident Evil was still scary for most people. Considering how iconic some of the lines are for Ultimus, I think they aren't actually affecting the map's atmosphere as much as people say. Now, before I wrap everything up on a nice little bow, someone in the YouTube comments wanted me to mention this, and it actually really worked well for a small segment I'd like to talk about for the map. I haven't said much about when it comes to music and zombies, but after Knocked, Verruckts would add hidden Easter egg songs that you could interact with, and it'd play during the game. Lullaby of a Dead Man was used in Verruckts, and it's an amazing song. In Shi No Numa, they added a song named The One. Play it, you have to go into the communication hut and interact with the phone. It's pretty creepy after you hear a voice come out of the phone, but afterwards it plays the song. The One is a really good song, and it's unique that it actually fits zombies. Not just in how it sounds during gameplay, but also how the lyrics actually relate to zombies. Instead of taking the perspective of, say, maybe a survivor in the apocalypse, it instead goes through this perspective of the undead, which I thought was really nice. But moving on, Shi No Numa was an experiment to empower the player, and while it had a bunch of flaws, it succeeded in attempting to shift the tone in gameplay, and made achieving high rounds viable. While different from Verruckts, and more similar to Knocked, the map is unique and carries traces of similarity from previous maps while still remaining different. But with what the developers learned at this point, with the basic beginnings of Knocked, the additions of Verruckts, and the possibility of achieving high rounds on Shi No Numa now viable, the next map is the last map of World of War, and is the final conclusion of the progression in World of War.
My vodka safe with. Electrocute cause so much beauty.
I've been waiting for the one. I've been waiting for the
Play that, bitch! Taste the pain!
is critical.
Power's out. Let's get turned back on.
Hoorah!